Phones are either turned off or switched to silence. I'll try and lead the way there. I remind senators that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about how and when policies were adopted. Officers are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and should be accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. I now welcome representatives of the Recreational Aviation Australia. Where are we there? That's yourself, Mr. King. Welcome. The Australian Warbirds Association. Warbirds Association. Thank you, Mr. Howard. The Australian Parachute Federation.
Yeah,
thank you, Mr. Hill. Did you used to parachute yourself?
Yes.
The minds of parachuters fascinate me, so be careful. We'll be asking some questions as to what makes you tick. The Australian Sport ROTORCRAFT Association. Oh, you're both. You represent the Australian Sport ROTORCRAFT Association as well?
No, I don't.
So who's that, Mr. Ferrier, is it?
No, there's no appearance.
No appearance from there? No appearance, Your Worship?
No.
All right. So we were advised that they were coming, so...
Senator, I'm with Mr. King.
Okay, all right. For the Hansard record, could you please give your names and capacity which you appear today? So we'll start with
my name is Spencer Ferrier, and I appear with Mr. King for the Recreational Aviation Australia Limited.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrier.
So my name's Tony King. I'm the Acting Chairman of Recreational Aviation Australia.
Thank you, Mr. King.
And my name is Mark Awad. I'm the current Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Warbirds Association Limited.
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
And Graham Hill, I'm the Chairman of the Australian Parachute Federation.
Now, each of you are going to be invited to give an opening statement, but just as you consider that, it may be that you've got something prepared. We just ask you to be conscious of the time that we've allowed 45 minutes plus or take a bit to hear from you guys. The longer you take with your statement, the less time the senators have to interrogate those matters of interest that they might want to pursue with CASA or somewhere else. So it's a matter of just trying to get a bit of balance, and particularly when we've got a number of witnesses, you know, I just ask you to be conscious that you're all sharing. After all that, I've done that. That you're all sharing the time. So, given I sit with the National Party, we'll start off on the right. Mr. Ferrier or Mr. King, if you want to make any statements.
Mr. King will make a statement on behalf of Recreational Aviation.
Right. Mr. King, you have the call.
Thanks, Senator. My name's Tony King. I'm the Acting Chairman of Recreational Aviation Australia Limited. I have been a member for 17 years and a member of the board for 5 years. My colleague, Mr. Ferrier, has been a member for 11 years and is an advisor to Recreational Aviation Australia. Our current chairman, Mr. Michael Monk, and our CEO, Michael Linke, offer their apologies as both are overseas. Pursuant to the authority of the Civil Aviation Act of 1988, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, which I will refer to as a CASA, has granted varying operation and administration authorities to 9 self-administering sport and recreational flying organisations. These are referred to as SAOs. The terms and conditions of each of the authorities is in response to each organisation's specific aviation activities. Recreational Aviation Australia is one such organisation. It has the largest number of members, pilots and aircraft. Its duties are to register aircraft in accordance with its rules, issue and reissue pilot certificates and maintenance certificates, set and maintain standards of flight operations and maintenance. All are subject to the oversight of the CASA. Recreational Aviation Australia administers almost 10,000 pilots, registers some 3,300 aircraft and oversees some 165 flight training schools across the whole of Australia, many of which operate in rural and remote Australia. Recreational Aviation Australia has operated for 35 years, with the last 10 years seeing significant growth as a result of the Light Sport Aircraft Standard, which was introduced in 2006. Since 2016, we've increased our membership numbers by 11% and our aircraft fleet size has grown by 3%. We attribute that growth to the improved management practices brought about by Recreational Aviation Australia's present overall management system. We continue to see solid growth in our sector and are excited by the future. Recreational Aviation Australia's members have flown about 320,000 hours in the last year, and the number of hours is rising steadily. Flying takes place from thousands of airports in all states and territories. Flying is in visual flight conditions, clear of cloud, and during daylight conditions. Maximum people on board, including the pilot, is 2. Our organisation has demonstrated an impressive safety record, which we see as also steadily improving. At present, we have recorded around 1 fatal accident every 100,000 flying hours in the past year. This is a record that we attribute to the delegated freedoms granted by the CASA and our organisation's response to that delegation, which includes careful, practical management of air safety, as well as practical management of aircraft registrations, pilot certification and standards, as well as maintenance, manufacturing and construction. Whilst we don't always agree with the regulators' requirements of us, we have satisfactorily engaged in a robust, respectful dialogue that has provided general agreement with the management and oversight processes we undertake. Turning to the specific issues at hand with regard to recent medical reform, we make the following comments. On medical reform, medical certification reform as a general concept is sound. In the case of RAAus, we're satisfied with the present medical system, which is working well. There is no safety case for a change concerning Recreational Aviation Australia. RAAus closely watches its mixture of training, certification of pilots, certification of aircraft, management of technical and operations. It has a program that is produced and oversighted by the CASA. This oversight is in the nature of continual reform. Having regard to the safe outcomes demonstrated by RAAus participants, the medical oversight is satisfactory and it works. RAAus medical standards. A pilot operating under the RAAus licence protocols must satisfy more than to hold a current driver's licence. The requirements are set out in section 2.16 of the organisation's operations manual. The pilot is required to be satisfied prior to each flight. For point 3, avoidance of uncertainty. This industry is sensitive to any change to the medical system and must take into account the personal and financial impact upon affected parties. Point 4, the magnitude of the investment to be considered. Many stakeholders in Recreational Aviation Australia sector have made and continue to make significant investments under the present rules. Flight schools, community groups such as aero clubs, maintainers, aircraft owners, pilots and the like. Erosion of that investment by introduction of changes not underpinned by a sound safety case should not occur. A recent economic study into the sport aviation sector suggests an industry-wide capital investment exceeding $1 billion. Any change by way of additional administrative costs must take this investment into account. Point 5, the issue of licences or certificates by government. If government were to begin to issue operating licences to self-declared eligible participants on a no-cost per issue basis, then government, by such agency as it creates, is entering into competition with itself. In particular, each sector has its overall licensing component in balance, including medical requirements. The concept of a parallel path for licensing and certification is acknowledged, but that path must be compatible with the costs and benefits to government of the creation and maintenance of the 9 organisations which it has itself encouraged and provided a foundation. Point 6, the present RAAus system is working and working well. Under the present system, recreational aviation has stabilised, is safe and actively patronised. The current system works well. It's the subject of ongoing review without difficulty or objection. It has been endorsed by government with the making of CASR Part 149. It is proven with the existence of 9 SAOs. CASR Part 149 will also allow and encourage new entrants into this market. Point 7, self-administration organisations are economical for government. The administrative burden to government is now adequately undertaken by private not-for-profit organisations, which in the case of Recreational Aviation Australia has removed from government in excess of $2.5 million per annum of outlays of a procedural or management nature, which with respect is not the function of government. Recreational Aviation Australia membership is not mandatory for an aircraft owner or pilot. It's a choice being made by many aviators because its system works. Point 8, flexibility of oversight is provided to CASA. The existing regulatory framework of the 9 SAOs enables an economical, flexible approach to regulation by CASA. There is no requirement to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to specialist needs, which invites constant change and cumbersome lawmaking. Point 9, risk-based approach to administration is a proven benefit. Industry has spoken on numerous occasions that a risk-based approach is required to best administer aviation in a safe manner. This is echoed in the 2008 Senate report, Administration of the CASA and Related Matters, 18th of September 2008, which notes that there is a preference by the AGAA and the Australian Sports Aviation Confederation to delegate regulation of non-passenger carrying activities to the accountable self-administered part of the sector. RAAus demonstrates that it is a capable manager of risk. Point 10, CASA itself accepts the present system and does not require alteration. CASA is ushering in the introduction of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations Part 149 in 2019. This reflects the will of the industry and has been made a priority in the past 12 to 18 months. In conclusion, the self-administration model works. The self-administration model allows for innovation. The self-administration model is safe.
All right, thank you, Mr. King. Would you be kind enough to allow the Secretary to have a copy of that so we can distribute that amongst the senators if
Certainly.
there's no objection?
Yep.
That'll may guide them in their examination of you. Mr. Awad, do you have an opening statement to make?
I do. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee, first of all. Mr. Chairman and Senators, my name is Mark Awad. I'm the Chief Executive of the Australian Warbirds Association and have served in this capacity since mid-2013. We represent over 560 members. They are comprised of warbird owners, pilots, maintainers, and enthusiasts nationwide. We are a self-administering organization operating through delegations provided to the association by CASA, and at present we have over 260 warbirds under our umbrella. These range from smaller aircraft such as Tiger Moths and smaller training aircraft all the way on up to second and third generation tactical fighters and the large aircraft that are operated by the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society over in Wollongong, such as the Lockheed Constellation and the collection of aircraft over at Temora, as well as those operated by the Air Force Museum down in Melbourne. We've acted in this capacity since 2007. Warbirds operating in Australia typically do so in the limited category of airworthiness under the legislative umbrella of CASR Part 132. Our administrative functions include, but are not limited to, the issuance of certificates of airworthiness, maintenance reviews and approvals, permits to fly, permit index evaluations and issuance, approval and oversight of adventure flight operations, and specialized training and endorsements, as well as air display evaluations. We accomplish a great deal on a fairly limited budget and have seen marked improvements in safety with regards to warbird operations under our administration. As an organization, we're ready to transition to CASR Part 149 as soon as practical and see it as a thoroughly consulted piece of legislation. And in our opinion, it will be a good piece of legislation that will underpin self-administration into the future. The Australian warbird community has an enviable safety record and professional culture. We work hard to maintain that. And in many respects, while we certainly work with CASA closely, we view them as a partner towards improving safety outcomes, both in our sector and across aviation. And we work closely with them at all levels. Our members largely operate effectively within CASA's current medical regime. We generally see advantages in maintaining a formal medical process, particularly in light of CASA's recent efforts to inject what seems to us to be a modicum of flexibility and common sense into them. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions and would like to thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Awad, for your presentation. You in a position to provide us with a copy of that so we can circulate to the senators? Is it in that form? It doesn't matter if it's not, but...
I'd be happy to, yeah. There's a few scribblings and notes on there.
That's all right.
That's
I
all
know.
right.
There'll be a few more on it by the time we're finished
Good.
with it.
Not a problem.
All right, Mr Hill.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and listen to my story. My name's Graham Hill, Chairman of the Australian Parachute Federation. I've been a Director of the Federation for a long time and Chairman for 4 years. I've done 13,000 skydives and flown 3,500 hours. I'm also President of the Airsport Confederation, which is a sporting aviation body of aviation sport. The APF, the Australian Parachute Federation, APF, administers Parachuting Australia as a self-administering organisation under a deed of agreement with CASA. The self-administration structure will change in the near future under the Part 149 regulation, recent regulation changes. The APF also oversees parachuting operations in Fiji under a contract with a Fiji regulator. As part of the administration, the APF oversees the training of pilots for the purpose of dropping skydivers. We have, at the moment, 500 pilots that have been issued authorities to drop skydivers, and they operate about 80 aircraft. Once the pilot are trained, they're issued with this jump pilot authority, which allows them to drop the jumpers. Applicants for skydivers must have a minimum Class 2 medical, a JPA in Australia, invariably progresses to a Class 1 medical once to obtain an instrument rating, because in Australia we're quite unique in that we're allowed to drop skydivers through cloud. And so you need an instrument rating to do that, to position the aircraft and fly the aeroplane. So that's how that's our role at the moment. Now, speaking specifically for parachuting industry, recent changes to the pilot's medical has been positive for parachuting. For our industry, feedback from the industry suggests the system works well. Now, but comments we'd like to make would be, one, I don't understand, this is just comments about the Class 2. I don't understand why you have a Class 2 and a Class 2 basic. It seems like it's asking for confusion, but why don't we have a Class 1, 2 and 3? Just a question. I have been an advocate for years of keeping the regulation of GA in harmony with the FAA in regard to medicals. I think there's a lot of other issues with other things, but in medicals I don't understand why they've got all the science, they've got much more experience, they've got all hostile weather, more aeroplanes. I think it's a no-brainer for me, but that's one of those. So that's all I've got. I don't think I can add any more to that.
Well, thank you, Mr Hill. Before I give the call to Senator Stool, I'd just like you all, in the context of the questions that you get off the senators, we've, over a long period of time, I mean, you're much more favourable in your comments to CASA today than perhaps any other witness we've had before us, and CASA will be watching this with great interest. And we're
back of the room, Chair.
I'm sure they are. And we've been watching CASA with great interest in terms of the development and progress around culture and attitude over the last few years. So I'm sure one of the things of interest to us is over-regulation of your industry. You've said some favourable things about the regulatory environment and the memorandums of understanding, the arrangements you have with CASA, and that's very positive, and we're very pleased to hear that. But as the senators asked you questions, whether it's specific about the regulatory or legal environment, if you feel inclined, you might just put a rider on your answers, either positively or negatively around that, because I know that goes to the heart of interest for many of the senators in this committee. Senator Stewart.
Thanks, Chair. Mr Hill, I just want to come back to your opening statement. And look, we're firm believers. We want to make it as streamlined and easy and cheap as possible while maintaining safety regulations. There's no argument. But this was first brought to my attention over the differences in medical requirements or medical certificates between now you've used that many acronyms, but your mob, okay, and I can't remember your acronym, sorry. SAOs, thank you, as compared to those who are PPLs and RPLs and whatever. So to get a medical certificate for your pilots, Mr. Hill, that are taking up jumpers, firstly, how many jumpers could there be in a plane? Is there a different grading to the pilots can take in number of jumpers?
Well, there could be 20. You know, we've had aircraft that carry 20 twin-engine, twin otters and Skyvans. We could fly them with a private licence, so we need a Class 2 medical. Once we progressed to getting the permission to jump through cloud, which was a battle in itself, but once we had that, then the requirement got a bit higher in that we needed instrument rating, so that changed things a little bit. Probably the only comment I'd get from our pilots is once you turn 60, it starts to be a lot more difficult. It's almost like as soon as you turn 65, they don't want you. You know, we want you to go and spend all this money and have a medical that lasts 6 months. Well, I think if I walked into a surgery and he said, look, you better come and see me in 6 months, I'd think there was something serious. Not that I was fit or not. So,
I'm with you. I've given up going to the doctors because you're well when you go there, and every time you come out, you're crook. You don't feel it, but yeah. Yeah, please jump in. Yeah.
You strike me as, your organisation would strike me as an organisation that may take parachuters up that were paying customers per se. So I just want to distinguish, your activity is in some sense commercial, isn't it? But you said you've got a private licence is what you said. The ride to height is the trip to the adventure, so to speak. We're not taking them as passengers and we don't carry passengers in aircraft, we only carry parachutists, which there is a difference. No, I understand that, but I'm just...
it's commercial.
It's commercial is what I'm trying to get to. Are those parachutists paying for the pleasure of the joy they get from jumping out of the plane?
No, they're paying to jump out of the aeroplane, but they're not going on a joyride.
Okay, I just thought that was an interesting distinction.
No, but let's just tidy this up because it's a very significant question.
Yeah, that's where I was going. Yeah.
So I come to an airport with my parachute in the boot of the car. I'm going to pay a fee to somebody, maybe the operator of a skydiving outfit, whatever it happens to be. But the pilot and the aircraft are compensated through subscription by each of the individual jumpers, I imagine, during the course of that event.
Oh, some of the pilots are not. No, they're not necessarily. They fly for hours and that sort of thing.
Right, so they fly for hours.
Yeah.
But the aircraft?
The aircraft, under a deed of agreement with CASA, the aircraft's maintained to a commercial standard, even though it's operating in a private
the aircraft. So I own the aircraft, whether I own the skydiving outfit or I just own an aircraft. At the end of the morning's jumps, I'm compensated, am I not, for the use of the aircraft?
Yes.
Right, so whether a pilot decides to do it for a personal benefit or financial reward, they're motivated by something else. This isn't an altruistic organisation where someone donates their plane and a pilot for free so everyone can jump out. So it is, the burden of the centre's question was, it is a commercial activity, paid for service. All right, thank you.
That's it. So what I'm going back to the best of your knowledge, Mr. Hill, are your pilots, do they have different medical certificates than those who don't have access to the self-administration model?
They have to have a jump pilot authority to fly skydivers, yes.
Sorry? Not
they don't have it. No, the medical, they would have a class 1 or a class 2, depending on the operation.
So is that a cheaper model or an easier to obtain model?
No.
Less?
No, it's not cheaper to obtain, no.
So is it the same as those who aren't members of self-administered organisations?
Yeah.
They are the same?
The same, yeah, the same standard for as if you were flying for let me think. It gets in the depends on the operation, on the type of operation you're comparing it with. They have to have, a pilot of a jump plane has to have basically all the things a commercial pilot has.
So there is no advantage. See, you have to help me out.
Yeah, right.
To the best, please. There are two sets of rules. There's one with the self-administered organisations there's a set of standards where you just say, yeah, look, everything's right, and I'm
Yes.
cutting it down. So they are able to obtain medical certificates that aren't as tough as those who are non-members of self-administered organisations.
No, they wouldn't be any different.
They're the same.
Yeah.
Your pilots.
Yes.
But that's not the same for your pilots, is
Yes.
it?
No,
If
we
you
have a
fly-
different standard.
Okay, so you're not in. Sorry, I don't mean to mean your mob. The parachuters pilots aren't under the same. What's the word? Help me out. You're a pilot.
SAO.
Yeah.
Standard.
There's a difference. So there is no advantage for the pilots of parachute jump planes. You don't get the same benefits, the easier self-administration and the easier medical certificates than Mr. Arwood's members and Mr. King's and Mr. Ferry's.
No, it's no easier. No, it's the same.
Same as them.
Yeah.
Hang on, now you're
Not
really...
the same as RAAus.
If I wasn't
It's the
ballsed
same
up before I asked you the
as
question I
Warbirds,
am
as
now.
I understand it. Yeah.
Sorry?
Point of fact, Warbirds operates to the same standard. We gain absolutely no advantage
Yeah.
through
Right.
that. We are held to the same standard as a ATPL pilot
Right.
would be.
Great, thank you. So I'll come back to your mob. You get, I'm sorry with your mob, RAAs, you have a system in place, which is great. Okay, part of my work is I'd rather see people come down to the easiest, cleanest path, not try and stuff it up for everyone else like we've done in the trucking industry. But anyway, so it's only members of the RAA that have the ability to get the easier medical certificate, is that correct?
No, sorry, Senator, that's not quite correct. Yes, it is true that RAAus pilots operate as assuming they're healthy, to a self-declared private driver's licence medical standard.
Great.
If they have any of the conditions that are screened for, then they have to have a doctor sign them.
Sorry,
up and
as
so
I
forth.
look up in the air and not recognise an aircraft, are you telling me that I might see a pilot who has to meet this standard, or I could be looking at an aircraft under the control of a pilot who meets a different and possibly lesser or superior standard? Is that what you're telling me?
Yes,
I would
sir.
have thought, poke the tongue out, check the heartbeat, bend over, everyone would have some sort of standard regime for the medical examination.
I don't think bend over is necessary, Chair.
Well, it may be, it depends.
If you've dropped your pen and stuck under your accelerator, you need.
So, am I wrong in that there's not... So if I'm a medical practitioner in Western Australia and I've just had a pilot in and I'm talking to my mate who's a medical practitioner in the Northern Territory and he's had a pilot in from a different association, are they going to say, oh, we don't check that, we don't do that, or we do additional things?
In short, Senator, that's correct.
Right, so can you tell me the difference, right?
Yes.
So let's tag between two organisations here that have a different medical regime, and let's compare some notes. Why don't you start, Mr Hill, and say, our blokes have to have an eye test and Mr Ferrier's blokes don't. I want to know what the difference is, and I want to know whether the standard is higher or lower between the two regimes or protocols.
Okay, our pilots have to have the CASA Class 1 medical or the Class 2 medical.
Right, just hold the phone.
And they've got to...
No.
Okay.
Do your pilots have to have a Class 1 or a Class 2 medical?
No.
No. Right.
We have a separate system which has been arranged and settled between us and the CASA,
Yes.
which is focused around the, dare I say it, simpler style of aircraft.
Okay, so it's less onerous, the medical that your members go through, than Mr Hill's members go through.
Yes, it is, Senator. However, it's also the case that the operations are quite different.
I appreciate that.
Don't
Appreciate
take any
that.
paying
Appreciate
passengers.
that. You haven't got 22 people in the back of the
Sorry,
plane.
yeah.
I get all of that. So, can you tell me, Mr King, what your people don't have to have examined in a medical examination that Mr Hill's people do? Eyes, ears, ability to speak, elbows checked. What's the difference?
For the bulk of RAAus pilots, a medical examination is not required.
None.
A self-declaration that you meet the health standard to hold a driver's licence is the requirement.
Car driver's licence.
Yes.
But you must hold a car driver's
And
licence.
Mr. What's the situation for your organisation? Just so we've got all three sort of
Chair,
issues.
make a point, feel free to carry on.
Sorry, Senator Patrick, I didn't quite catch that.
Sorry, is this to Mr. Awad
It's a big point. Yeah.
for the
Yes,
Warbirds? Do you have a self-declared medical standard, or do you have to go through a medical certificate?
Within the Australian Warbirds community, we are operating on PPLs, CPLs, or ATPLs.
So you
Guys, listen, sorry, Senator, we'll come back to you directly. Listen, you are in the kingdom of acronyms, and we wouldn't have a single clue what you just said. But you would be picking up the vibe that there's a Model 1 and a Model 2 medical certificate, and there's a self-declaration. Could you just help us? He's a bird-out truck driver, I'm a
I'll be
retired
happy to.
detective. I don't even know what he done before he come here. But keep it very simple so we can get through this and get some meaningful outcome from this.
I will be happy to,
Senator.
Senator. We operate on private pilot's license, commercial pilot's license, or airline transport pilot's license, respectively. As such, we must hold either a Class 2 for private operations or a Class 1 medical for any operations that are deemed commercial.
So just to confirm, that means you can't self-assess.
We cannot. We operate exactly like any other
So is Mr Hill's members.
Like Mr
general
Hills.
aviation
Like
operation.
Mr Hills mob. Same.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so
Oh, yeah, no, that's what I wanted to get out, yeah.
okay, so
Before I go to the different standard costs.
Yep.
can I ask the question then, just in terms of the safety case difference between what RAA does? So you've got aircraft in the air, and they're trained to a particular level. My understanding is potentially less so than Warbirds and the parachuting pilots. They don't have to complete a medical, yet perhaps the better trained pilots, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but presumably the level of training required for the other two organisations is higher. I'm just trying to understand how that rationalises itself in terms of the safety case. Better trained pilots require a full medical, and the lesser trained pilots don't require a medical.
Senator, the difference comes down to the difference in operations. For example, RAAus pilots, if they only hold the self-declared medical, and there are some who have a Class 2, but if they only hold the self-declared medical, they're not allowed to operate in controlled airspace. They're not. All RAAus pilots are only allowed to carry a maximum of one passenger. Not allowed to carry passengers for hire or reward. In fact, not allowed to conduct any sort of commercial operation other than flight training. And at present, our flight instructors have to have a Class 2 medical.
Sure. Okay. Now, in terms of Warbirds, you'd be flying an aircraft potentially that's only got one seat, and is it a commercial operation or is it a pleasure operation?
Well, the operations differ. We have operators that are operations that are commercial in nature, and we have operations that are private in nature. We have aircraft that are single seat, on up to the Lockheed Constellation, operated by the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society, that is a 1950s vintage transcontinental airliner.
All right, but just to delineate again, the commercial operations, clearly you require a commercial pilot's
They do.
licence, and therefore perhaps the higher medical standard. If I just now go to someone who's flying a Warbird for pleasure, so not for commercial gain, how would I differentiate that particular pilot who does have to get a medical with perhaps an aircraft flying around with a single person in it from RAA in terms of safety?
I can only speak to our operations, but in terms of safety, our pilots are obviously complying with, as the RAAus pilots and any others, will be complying with the regulations specific to their operations. In our case, that mandates, if you're doing private flying, that mandates at least a Class 2 medical.
Sure, but I'm trying to get to the
Currently.
reasoning underneath it, whether there's any difference in safety case in respect to that. Because right now, if I look at the non-commercial Warbird flying in an aircraft that has one passenger, I can't see the difference in terms of safety against, say, an RAA pilot flying around with one person in an aircraft, yet they have two different licence standards.
Now, there are the differences. I'll be happy to explain some to you, and
Sure.
I'm sure I may leave some out here, but there is certainly the scope of the operation. So the Warbird is in most circumstances able to operate in and out of controlled airspace, whereas, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally the RAAus aircraft will not be able to. So they are outside of more populous areas. The Warbird is also a more sophisticated aircraft in pretty much every sense and more difficult to operate. So there is going to be a higher standard on that.
But that would be a training standard versus, I'm just looking at the medical standard. I imagine is the suggestion that because you're operating in controlled airspace, you require a better medical standard, or because you're operating a more complicated aircraft, you require a high medical standard, or is that more relate to training standards?
I would argue that it is all of the above. There is everything is intertwined here in this, Senator. It's and it speaks to why there is a difference in standards. Not all aircraft and not all pilots are treated equal in that respect. There is a higher standard for training, a far higher standard for training to fly certain Warbirds than there is to fly RAAus aircraft, and that speaks, I think, to the type of operations as well as the aircraft's capabilities and potential. So it's certainly, in all respects, there is a higher standard.
Sure. So I'm just trying to get to the nub of it. Is it a highest? I get the higher training standard if you've got a more complicated aircraft, and I get the higher training standard if you have to fly in controlled airspace, which means you have to very tightly comply with the rules and have all sorts of communication skills and so forth. I'm just trying to isolate the medical aspects of
and there is a higher medical standard. And if I may ask a question,
I understand. I understand there is a higher medical, and that's not my question. My question is to ask the question why in those circumstances. And the points of difference you've made is that one of them operates in control. Sometimes you operate in controlled airspace. Sometimes you're operating an aircraft that's more complex. Now those questions go to training, in my view. But I could be convinced if you could put something on the table that said this is why you need a higher medical standard in those two circumstances.
Well, with regards to the access to controlled airspace, that is part of it. But controlled airspace typically also includes flight over more populous regions and areas, and it also speaks to, I believe, the potential. With RAAus aircraft and where they operate primarily, I think Mr. King mentioned earlier that there's a risk-based approach to it, and it is certainly, with regards to the risk, there is a deemed, and this has been a decision made by CASA in conjunction with RAAus. So again, I'm probably getting out of my area of expertise.
I understand you're not a medical professional. I just thought you might better help.
But I would believe that it is a risk-based approach, and quite frankly, I think it's an effective one because we don't see aircraft of any sort, let alone RAAus, dropping out of the sky. Because
I'm just saying that the word risk-based approach is almost a rhetorical word that makes everyone feel good. I'm actually trying to get to the assessment of the risk. That's what I want to get to, is to, and maybe you're not the right people in the context, you're not medical professionals.
Senator, there's an issue, I think, which might be of assistance, and that is the recreational aviation aircraft requires to be understood, and I say that with respect. That is to say, it has a limit of 600 kilograms, it must have a single engine, it must have fixed undercarriage, and it must have a fixed pitch propeller. Now, each of those elements requires a level of medical stress on the pilot to ensure that each of those elements is in fact working during the course of a flight. If the wheels get stuck up, that's a problem. in recreational aviation, it's not a problem because they're down all the time. Likewise, a variable pitch propeller, which can be adjusted, is a complexity issue which is not addressed by recreational aviation. Likewise, the presence of multiple passengers raises stress on the pilot. Because that doesn't exist, because each of those things don't exist, the aircraft is not heavy, so it doesn't strike the ground as hard and as fast. All of these matters are the basis on which our training, our medical and our operational standards are built. And the evidence is that medical factors involved in misadventure with this set of aircraft is very, very low. And to add to the complexity by requiring a pilot who is prepared to fly in that regime, by increasing the amount of intervention into his health, adds cost, delay, and requires an administrative overload as well. And the evidence shows that's not needed because the people are not suffering from the disorders.
We've run out of time, but I think that was most helpful, actually, that last answer.
well,
Thank you very much.
we can-
We might test that with the next witness.
Okay, Senator
Thanks.
Brockman.
Great, thanks. And my colleagues have covered a part of the area I wanted to go to, but particularly for RAAus, if I'm saying that correctly, I just want to raise a couple of things in your response to CASA on this issue. And, you know, I admit they do sort of raise red flags in my mind, and I'm with Senator Stirl that we want to see the fairest and least burden possible to achieve the safety outcomes. But, you know, in your response, you said one of the issues, what are the likely cost implications? That there is a direct cost to RAAus, particularly significant loss of revenue. If medical requirements are reduced, this could mean that recreational pilot's licence requirements will have a direct advantage over RAAus pilot certificate. And you go on to say this could result in a dramatic effect on the financial position of RAAus. Can you talk us through your discussions with CASA in regards to that particular aspect of the changes? Did CASA take that into account? Did CASA tell you they took that into account?
You mean the potential for a relaxation of CASA's medical standards to impact RAAus' financial position? Is that
Yes,
the question?
the potential on any changes to the recreational pilot's licence to directly impact your financial position.
So the recreational pilot's licence is something that CASA introduced 4 or 5 years ago, and it's quite comparable with the RAAus pilot certificate. In fact, CASA has publicly stated that the training requirements, that RAAus training is acceptable for the issue of a recreational pilot's licence. But it's a CASA issued licence and requires pilots to fly under CASA's regime with certain constraints. RAAus didn't see a great deal of value for pilots in that regime when it was introduced, and that was our position, remains our position. There also there hasn't been a great uptake by pilots themselves going for the RPL versus either a PPL, which is the next licence up in the CASA regime, or an RAAus pilot certificate. So RAAus does have concerns, or did have concerns, that relaxation of medical standards in the CASA regime could impact the number of pilots who would prefer that approach to our approach. So that was the basis for that statement to CASA. The document you've quoted from was a response to a CASA consultation paper.
Yep.
Other than submitting that response, I'm not aware that there have been any discussions with CASA about the potential for their prospective relaxation of medical standards to affect RAAus.
So I'm I must admit, I'm reasonably new to this place. I've been here a year now. Definitely new to this sector. Is RAAus a net contributor to CASA? Do you receive money from government? How does it all work?
So RAAus, as with the other SAOs, receives a certain amount of funding from CASA to perform functions under a deed of agreement, safety-related functions. The funding we receive from CASA in no way approaches the cost of performing those functions. Our estimate is that roughly 70% of the RAAus budget, which is about 2.8 million a year, so 70% of that goes on performing functions under the deed of agreement with CASA. The funding we get from CASA equals about 4% of our budget.
So what's the I've seen figures from the excellent briefing pack the Secretariat put together that says the cost of licence under the RAAus structure is about half that of a private pilot's licence. Is that?
Yeah, there are a number of factors that go into that. Firstly, because RAAus is a lower cost system than the CASA system, the cost of training hours is lower. So that's a big factor in the difference in how much it costs to get a basic qualification. And there's also the minimum number of hours is different as well. I forget how many hours it is now to get a private pilot's licence. It's there's a minimum of 20, although very few achieve it in 20 because it's competency based. 25 to 30 would be fairly typical as a minimum number of hours to get an RAAus pilot certificate. It's significantly more than that to get a private pilot's licence. So those sorts of differences go into making up the difference in cost to get one qualification or the other.
Thank you, Senator. And I mean, we could obviously go on for hours here. Can I invite you to do this? Well, firstly, thank you for your attendance. And could I invite you to do this? If you think that there are regulations that are required, we'd ask that you write to this committee and lay down what those regulations are and the reasoning behind it. If you think there are regulations that exist that just simply ought not exist, we'd also like to hear from your associations in relation to that. Or if there are regulations that you think can be improved in terms of, changing their thrust or the phraseology around them, we'd like to hear from that too. The committee promises you those things will be treated seriously. We'll make sure they go through to the Minister and to CASA to the extent that we can with comments from our committee. So, Mr Ferrier, Mr King, Mr Awad, Mr Hill, thank you. We wish you all the best and a safe return to your port of intention.